The subcommittee will now receive testimony from the second panel before us today. First, my apologies to all the witnesses for the delay. We appreciate you staying with us and testifying, and regret that if we were more thoughtful on this, we probably would have scheduled this for another day instead of running here this late. But I get the feeling that you may be back again at some point, convenient to everybody. This looks like an area we want to explore in some more depth at some point. Let me just introduce the panel first for the record, if I could. Mr. Michael J. Sullivan serves as the Director for Acquisitions and Sourcing Management at the United States Government Accountability Office. His team is responsible for examining the effectiveness of agency acquisition and procurement practices and meeting their mission performance objectives and requirements. He also manages a body of work designed to help the Department of Defense apply best commercial practices to better develop advanced weapon systems. Mr. Sullivan holds both a BA and an MPA from Indiana University. Mr. Dyke Wetherington is the Deputy Director for Unmanned Warfare and Portfolio Systems Acquisition in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, Logistics, and the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition. He must have quite the business card. A retired Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Air Force, he is responsible for acquisition oversight for unmanned aircraft systems and associated subsystems. He is also the functional lead for the Deputy Secretary of Defense Directed UAS Task Force. He holds a BS from the United States Air Force Academy and an MA from California State University. And the Honorable Kevin Wolf serves as the Assistant Secretary for Export Administration at the United States Department of Commerce. Prior to this, he was a partner at Bryan Cave LLP, where he worked on export administration regulations, international traffic and arms regulations, and sanctions administered by the Office of Foreign Assets Control. He holds a BA from the University of Missouri and an MA and JD from the University of Minnesota. Thank you again, all of you, for being here and sharing your substantial expertise with us. It's our policy to swear in the witnesses, so if you would please arise and raise your hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth? Thank you. The record will please reflect that all of the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. I remind you of what I think you already know, that all of your written testimony will be placed on the record in its entirety, and we would just ask you if you could summarize that in about 5 minutes each. We'll do some question and answering after that, and thank you. We'll start with you, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Congressman Flake. Thanks for this opportunity to discuss GAO's report on the Department's unmanned aircraft systems acquisition efforts from July of last year. My statement today focuses on acquisition outcomes, the extent of collaboration among the services in those acquisitions, and recent investment decisions related to unmanned aircraft acquisitions. As has been stated earlier in the hearing, from 2002 to 2008, the number of unmanned aircraft in DoD's inventory has grown from about 167 to more than 7,000 as a result of growing demand from the field. Once fielded, these aircraft have proven to be quite valuable to our warfighters. However, there have been growing pains along the way. We assessed the 10 largest unmanned aircraft programs, 8 air systems and 2 payload systems, for the report that we did in last July, and found that their development costs had grown by $3 billion, or 37% on average. Procurement funding has increased for most of those programs, but this is mostly due to increases in the number of aircraft being procured, which is a good thing. Nonetheless, procurement unit costs have grown by 12% on average. Our assessment found varying degrees of collaboration among the services. For example, the Marine Corps was able to avoid the cost of initial system development and a lot of duplication of capabilities, and was also able to deliver needed capability to its Marines very quickly by simply choosing to procure existing Shadow aircraft from the existing Army program. In another case, the Navy is expecting to save time and money on its broad area maritime surveillance system by using the existing Air Force Global Hawk airframe. However, it's developing a lot of its own unique subsystems rather than joining the Air Force in some of those procurements. In contrast to those examples, the Army and the Air Force did not effectively collaborate on their Predator and Sky Warrior programs, despite strong direction from the Department to do so. there's no real, we don't really have any estimates of the cost that might have occurred because of the duplicative efforts there, but we do know that the Army had to stand up a program office and had a development effort of over $500 million. So that probably is some costs that they didn't need. Much greater commonality could have been achieved as each of those weapon systems are being developed by the same contractor. One is a variant of the other. Service-centric requirements and an unwillingness to collaborate were key factors in limiting commonality across these programs. Despite the Department's efforts to emphasize jointness and encourage commonality, the services continued to establish unique requirements, some of which have raised concerns about unnecessary duplication, such as the Sky Warrior and the Predator. Since our report was issued, the Department has made an investment decision to increase development of unmanned aircraft and procure larger numbers, which we think is a good thing. It also recognizes that this important investment must be leveraged effectively. One of the major goals of the UAS roadmap is to foster the development and practice of policies, standards, and procedures for operating unmanned aircraft and to promote the enforcement of government, international, and commercial standards for the design, manufacture, testing, and operation of unmanned systems. The roadmap has recognized the potential for unprecedented levels of collaboration to gain capabilities at reduced acquisition costs. And we have reported in the past that one key to increased collaboration and commonality is the use of open systems across product lines, across airframes, subsystems, and even down to the component level. Unmanned systems are critical to the Department's mission and will continue to grow in numbers and in effectiveness. In order to acquire them most efficiently in today's environment of constrained resources, the Department should follow through on its stated goals and continue to force joint standardized weapon systems wherever it makes sense. Mr. Chairman, that completes my statement.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your statement. Mr. Weatherington.
Mr. Chairman, Congressman Flake, thank you for the opportunity to appear today before you to discuss the Department of Defense's Unmanned Aircraft Systems Acquisition Programs, specifically Department initiatives to achieve greater commonality and efficiencies. My testimony will address a full spectrum of DoD UAS systems. This distinction is important because we have pursued opportunities for commonality and efficiency successfully across the full range of DoD unmanned aircraft systems, including small unmanned aircraft systems. Table 1 in the provided testimony is included to identify the broad diversity of unmanned aircraft systems supporting a broad range of warfighter needs, and you have examples of each of the groups of those systems on the table in front of you. The GAO report, Defense Acquisitions, Opportunities Exist to Achieve Greater Commonality and Efficiency Among Aircraft Systems, was released last July and reviewed the DoD UAS program group 3 through 5. GAO had 5 recommendations. The Department partially concurred with the recommendation to conduct a rigorous, comprehensive analysis of requirements for current UAS and to develop a strategy for making systems and subsystems among these programs more common. At the time of the review, the UAS Task Force, with support from the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, had already completed a comprehensive analysis of the potential for commonality between the current Air Force Predator program and the Army's Extended Range Multipurpose Program. Since the report was released, the UAS Task Force, in coordination with Joint Staff, has conducted a rigorous review of the Navy's BAMS program and the Air Force Global Hawk program to evaluate opportunities for achieving greater commonality and joint efficiencies. We have completed that analysis along with one addressing signals intelligence or SIGINT payload commonality. The Department will concurred with the remaining 4 GAO recommendations in that report. Since the GAO has released its report, the Department has completed its 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review, and the President has submitted his fiscal year 2011 budget. The QDR highlights the continuing warfighter need for increased intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and force protection capabilities provided by unmanned aircraft system, and the budget reflects the Department's increased investment needs in these areas. This investment is consistent with the acquisition reform goal in DoD's high priority performance goals presented in the analytical perspective volumes of the President's FY11 budget. The Department's investment in operation in UAS continues to increase as demand for a wide range of UAS capabilities expands, as was discussed in the first panel. DoD's annual budget for development and procurement of UAS has increased from about $1.7 billion in fiscal year 2006 to over $4.2 billion in fiscal year 2010. During that same period, DoD U.S. operations have grown from about 165,000 hours to over 550,000 hours annually, and there's a graphic in the testimony. Unmanned aircraft system inventory has increased from less than 3,000 to over 6,500 aircraft, as been mentioned previously. The Department is making significant investments in unmanned aircraft systems, and that is projected to grow significantly over the next 5 years. Achieving commonality, interoperability, and joint efficiencies in development, production, and operation and support is critical to controlling costs and delivering interoperable, reliable systems to the warfighter with capabilities they need to win. We will continue to improve the defense acquisition system and have formed the UAS Task Force jointly to address critical UAS technology and acquisition issues to enhance operation, enable interdependencies, commonalities, and other efficiencies. Just a quick update on our current DoD UAS programs. This year, the Department made the commitment to grow Air Force Predator and Reaper Combat Air Patrols, or CAPS, to 50 by 2011, and the Air Force is on track to achieve this goal and will continue to expand the force structure to support up to 65 CAPS by FY13. The Army is also expanding many classes of UAS, including accelerated production of the Predator class ERMP and also upgrading Shadow. In addition to the quick reaction capability of 8 ERMP aircraft already fielded in Iraq, the Army will field a second quick reaction capability to Afghanistan this year. The Army also plans to field 13 ERMP systems of 12 aircraft each to each of the combat aviation brigades starting in FY11. Navy is in engineering and manufacturing development phase for its BAMS UAS program and is introducing sea-based unmanned aircraft systems with its vertical takeoff, unmanned aerial vehicle, and its small tactical unmanned aircraft system. Navy plans to award the STUAS contract later this year. Finally, all the military departments and Special Operations Command are operating the hand-launched Raven with over 4,700 aircraft delivered to the warfighter. Closing, Mr. Chairman, the Department is investing in UAS. Investment in UAS is projected to continue to grow. We recognize achieving commonality, interoperability, and joint efficiencies in development, production, operations, and support is critical to controlling costs and delivering interoperable, reliable systems to the warfighters. Thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Wolf, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Tierney, Congressman Flake, members of the committee, professional staff. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before your committee on the Department of Commerce's role in export controls of unmanned aerial vehicles, related components, and technology. The Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, within the Department of Commerce administers the controls on the export, re-export, and in-country and transit of a range of dual-use items, commodities, software, technology that have both civilian and military uses. In doing so, BIS works closely with a number of departments and agencies, including the Departments of Defense, State, Energy, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Homeland Security, and its Bureau of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Department of Justice. The dual-use export control system is an important tool to protect the national security of the United States against diverse threats that our nation faces. State and non-state actors seek to acquire weapons of mass destruction and the means to deliver them, as well as conventional arms and other items that could be used for terrorist purposes. BIS implements the dual-use control system through the Export Administration Regulations. Under the EAR, BIS regulates the export of certain UAVs and related items based on multilateral control lists and other items that could be used in or for UAVs through unilateral controls on end uses and end users. What I mean by that is that the dual-use regulations administered by the Bureau of Industry and Security are one part of a greater scheme. You have multilateral controls, principally the Missile Technology Control Regime, sometimes called the MTCR, and the Wassenaar Arrangement, which are arrangements between, depending upon the regime, 34 to 40-plus member countries, which have agreed to establish lists of items and technologies that should be controlled for export and re-export outside of the member countries. And these lists that are agreed to and worked on and revised regularly by various committees by which the Commerce Department and other U.S. departments participate are updated to take into account current threats and current issues. These lists that the MTCR creates and the other multilateral regimes work are the basis for the list of items that the U.S. government controls for export and re-export or in-country transit. The Commerce Department regulations, the dual-use regulations, again, even within the domestic regime, are only one part of that. The other part is what are called the International Traffic in Arms regulations, which are the regulations administered and governed and implemented by the State Department's Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. And principally what those regulations govern in terms of the export and re-export are defense articles such as UAVs that are specifically designed or modified for military application, or parts or components for those UAVs that are specifically designed or modified for military UAVs, rather, and all technical data and services that are directly related to the UAVs and to those parts and components. And for those items and for services related to those items, it's a worldwide licensing requirement except for Canada in some limited circumstances. A subset of that are the controls that the dual-use control. So anything that's military is not controlled by us. It's those UAVs and related parts, components, accessories, and technology or software for their production or development that are controlled for worldwide export. That is, if you were in the United States and you had one of these items or an accessory that was specially designed for a dual-use UAV, license would be required from the U.S. government before it's exported. Similarly, if it's an item that is of U.S. origin or otherwise subject to these regulations, a license would be required to re-export it from one destination to another destination. And then behind these rules is a vigorous set of enforcement authorities, both civil and criminal penalties that are available to the U.S. government for those individuals and companies that violate these regulations, export something from the United States or re-export it if it's otherwise controlled without a license. There's a series, as our testimony, my written testimony has, of enforcement actions against companies, both civil and criminal, for people trying to export and re-export things directly or indirectly related to UAV manufacture, production, or use outside the United States in violation of these rules. So with that general summary of U.S. export control law and UAVs, I'd be happy to answer any specific questions you might have.
So, Mr. Wolf, not the first time you've given that rap, right?
Excuse me?
Not the first time you've given that rap.
No, I indeed, yes.
We understand that. But look, we just finished a panel. I think you were here for at least part of it, if not all of it, where the witnesses on that panel told us there's no way you can get this back in the box. That we have Hezbollah out there with UAVs, we have Russia, China, other people on that. So how successful is our export regime?
Well, it is very successful. There is an active, robust enforcement action. And with respect to the comment that he was making, one thing that I failed to mention but should have is even with respect to parts and components that aren't specifically listed in either set of regulations or that are not specially designed for use in a UAVs, both the WASNR member, the MTCR member countries and certainly the United States have controls on exports of just about anything to certain end users. So, for example, if a coffee cup or something that's going to be used in developing a UAV were destined for, or from the United States rather, or a U.S. origin item re-exported from a third country, if it were destined to a prohibited end user, things that are called either denied entities, which are the list of companies that have participated, many of them, in UAV or other proliferation-related activities that we don't like, or what the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control maintains are called specially designated nationals. If somebody were exporting something to one of those entities or individuals, that would be prohibited without U.S. government authorization, which of course wouldn't be denied. Similarly, even if not to an entity or an end user that's been listed by the U.S. government, our regulations, the commerce regulations, have what are called general prohibitions on exporting just about anything that's subject to the EAR to anyone in a certain group of countries if it is with respect to certain types of UAVs, or to just about anyone in most countries if there's knowledge or reason to believe, it's a fairly broad standard, that it's destined for a UAV production-related or for a weapons of mass destruction-related end use. So, what he was referring to is that there are some things that are so common that they just simply can't be controlled. I understand the point, but what it failed to take into account are the very broad controls over, the catch-all controls over prohibited end uses and prohibited end users.
So I guess that leaves us then with the question of who are the member participants in the missile technology control regime and other similar protocols, and who's not?
Well, it's funny you should ask, because I can leave this for you if you like. It's, I think, about 34
I would
members.
like, if you have it there, would certainly like to put that on the record.
I'll enter it into the record.
Okay.
Of who the
But now
members
you can
are.
tell us a little bit, is Iran in the
Well,
group?
no. With respect to Iran and four
Russia,
other countries.
China?
No, China is not a member of the MTCR.
Pakistan?
Pakistan is not a member of the MTCR. But a couple of things. With respect to Iran and Sudan and Syria and Cuba and North Korea, there's an absolute embargo on all items that are of U.S. origin or, which would capture and control anything, whether it's for a UAV or not.
But no cap on China selling them similar technology, or Pakistan selling typical similar technology or whatever. So we've got it coming out of this country back and forth, but no international agreement to which they are a member that might stop them from doing that.
I don't know the scope of China's efforts or not in an open session to sell UAV-related technology to Iran, Pakistan, or any of the other countries. What I can, with respect to China in particular, to the extent that U.S. origin items would be used in an activity, there is something called a China rule informally, or a China catch-all, depending upon how you speak to it. But really, it is a requirement that for even items that aren't specific to UAVs, like general-purpose avionics, if the exporter or re-exporter knows or has reason to believe, again, a very open standard, that the item is destined to China and destined for a military end use, again, even of something that otherwise wouldn't require a license for export to China, a license is required from the U.S. government before exporting it.
Thank you. Very quickly, Mr. Wetherington, you say the problems that Mr. Sullivan pointed out in terms of compatibility are solved. You got the message? Already done.
Sir, we are working on those challenges. As Mr. Sullivan pointed out, there's been very rapid growth in this technology area. And to provide the warfighter the capabilities he needed in many cases, and some that were talked about in the first panel, DoD procured capabilities we currently had. Those, in some cases, did not achieve the full interoperability and commonality that the department would like to have, and so we're working on those. My written testimony has many examples of areas where OSD, working with joint staff and the services, are working hard to improve our interoperability and commonality. But today, we do have systems that aren't fully integrated into the manner that we would like them to be.
Okay. I'll get back to Mr. Sullivan and ask you his opinion on that in a second. Mr. Flake.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on that, Mr. Worthington. It's a little baffling that, if we're talking about old systems that have been around a long time, and after 9/11, obviously the effort, and we spent a lot of money at Department of Homeland Security for interoperability, whether it's firemen being able to communicate with whomever or whatever. But you'd think with a relatively new technology like this, that ought to be the least of the problems, that if we're acquiring, procuring these, that ought to be assumed, I guess, that there'd be interoperability. So it just surprises me that that's still a problem. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure, sir. For example, the Air Force began procuring Predator unmanned aircraft systems in 1994. At the time we were procuring those systems, the department did not have a fully interoperable data link for that class of system. So what was procured was a commercial C-band data link that met the specific requirements of Predator, but was not fully integrated into the DoD force structure. Congress has weighed in on that and provided direction to the department that all the service should migrate to a common standard, which we call Common Data Link, CDL. We're in the process of doing that. That data link has many advantages. One of the advantages, it's a fully digitized link. It also provides full encryption for the data being pushed over that data link. The limitation was, at the time we were buying Predator, a data link with that capability did not exist in a form factor that we could get on Predator. And so the decision was made. The department would take some risk in some areas, data links being one of them, to provide the warfighter with the immediate requirement we had. At the same time, the department was working very hard to go back and upgrade those systems, define interoperability interfaces where they don't exist, require those interfaces where they do exist across the services.
Mr. Sullivan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would bring up between the Army's Sky Warrior and the Air Force's Predator program is probably the most blatant experience that we had with the ability to look at requirements for the warfighter in two different services and come to some common agreement, and it just didn't happen. And that was, if you refer to my written statement there, we tracked the history of the ability of the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Undersecretary for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics to try to force that. As I stated in my oral statement, at least $500 million were spent to start an Army program office and a separate development program, when the Army was looking for basically the same characteristics and the same capabilities that the Air Force had with the Predator. So, you know, that's one example. There's another example with the Fire Scout, where the Navy and the Army basically could have bought the same system, but the Army decided that they wanted a data link that would be compatible with the future combat systems, which, as we know now, has been terminated. And in fact, the Army's version of Fire Scout has been terminated too. That established two separate programs because they couldn't get together on the data link. It's things like that. There's a high performance kind of a parochial culture across the services that I think a lot of people understand, but in today's environment where every dollar counts, and in addition to that, we have an opportunity with this new technology to be more standard and common. It's just our belief that the services should try harder to find these commonalities, especially when the department itself is pointing them out to them and requesting that they work harder to do that.
Thank you. That's helpful. Mr. Wolf, it would seem that in terms of export controls, as the chairman said, this is pretty much off-the-shelf stuff when it comes to the units themselves, whatever we're talking about, but it's the communications side of it, the software, I guess it is, that is that where most of your focus really is? Or if not, why not? Because it would seem that the ability of others to get a hold of the software and I guess some hardware to interfere with communications here would be the problem that we ought to worry about.
Going to the question of what the focus is, it depends on what you're talking about with respect to a particular export-related transaction. If it's an off-the-shelf item, for example, that wasn't specially designed or modified for a UAV and isn't otherwise captured or listed on what's called the Commerce Control List, and wasn't somehow specifically designed or modified for a military application, then you're right, it wouldn't be a listed item. And that item, it would be an otherwise commercial off-the-shelf item with multiple applications.
I
and
guess some of the data link stuff that we communicate, that's all proprietary within military anyway. Is that correct? Or?
But if I don't know the technology well enough to be able to comment, but if for some reason it was directly related to a military application or otherwise specifically modified for a military end item, then it would be controlled under the other set of regulations. Okay. So,
thank you.
Thanks. So, Mr. Wetherington, let me get this right. I read your title as Deputy Director, Unmanned Warfare Portfolio Systems Acquisition in the Office of Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, and the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition. you're responsible for the acquisition oversight for Department of Defense unmanned aerial systems and associated subsystems, including census and communication links within all of that alphabet soup I just read on that. So you're the guy. So how is it that were you not there yet, or was it under your watch that the Army and the Air Force has flipped off the directive to work cooperatively and have some commonality?
Sir, I was there, and we had oversight over that acquisition program that grew out of the requirements process. The Army ERMP program came through the JSIDS process, and that process
Can you
first...
spell that out for the record, JSIS?
JCIDS. And it's
You're not gonna get out that
Joint
easy,
Service...
The temptation
Joint-
is there, though, isn't it?
Joint Capability Requirements Process.
Thank you.
When the Army requirement for ERMB came in, the department's position is that we always look to current solutions to meet those warfighting requirements. So the Army's requirement was looked at against the Air Force Predator program, and the JSIDS process, including up to the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, determined that that Air Force solution did not meet the Army requirements. Now, the Army fully competed that program, which was core to the ATNL goals of maximum competition where we can get it. The competitor who won that program was the same competitor who built the Air Force Predator program, and I would characterize that the Army took a good Air Force design and made it better. Mr. Sullivan has identified that there were unique requirements between the two systems that did not afford identical subsystem capabilities, and the data link happens to be one of those. The Army's got a relay requirement that the Air Force does not have, and OSD and Joint Staff spent a lot of time at the subsystem level doing analysis to determine what subsystems could be common. There is direction both out of ATNL and out of Joint Staff for the two services to buy a common video system, video ball, for those two programs, which is in my written testimony. We are undergoing a review to look at SIGINT capability on those two platforms that will come over in a congressional report very soon. But as to the Army simply buying the Air Force Predator system to meet their requirement, the department's process looked at that and determined that was not sufficient to meet the Army requirement.
Was the Army requirement sufficient to meet the Air Force requirement?
Since that, well, sir, that is somewhat overcome by events because the Air Force has decided to terminate procurement of Predator in lieu of the larger Reaper system that they're procuring today.
So here's what I think, or what I see as a potential problem here, or whatever. Too many cooks in the kitchen. We're talking about unmanned aerial vehicles, and we have a number of different services, obviously, but we have one Department of Defense. And we continue to let each department, each service go off and do its own thing, as if they're all in a different military of their own right and working for some other government. I don't know. But my understanding of having the Department of Defense and having a joint chiefs of staff's operation here was to get some uniformity across the way and have somebody make some decisions with some discipline at the top that would say, all right, you tell me what you want, you tell me what you want, but we're going to get one for the 2 or 3 or 4 of you or whatever that works best for everybody, and then maybe we could do a little subsets off or whatever. We're not going to do 8 or 9 because yours isn't exactly like yours is. That gets tremendously expensive. We don't have unlimited amounts of money. You know, we just don't have it. You know that from your own work on that. So why don't we see a better structure with more discipline and somebody stand up to the different services and say, this can't go on? You know, and that's what I think your role at DOD is. I'm not putting this on you. I understand you're the deputy director and deputies get to do so much or whatever, but isn't somebody there thinking along those lines and saying, like, look, this just doesn't make sense. We haven't got an unlimited pocketbook here?
Mr. Chairman, that's a very fair question, and I would articulate that the department is doing a very good job of that. Again, in my written testimony, there are several examples of where, through OSD and Joint Staff encouragement, we we have gotten all the services to procure identical or virtually identical systems. Mr. Sullivan commented on the Marine Corps decision to buy the Army Shadow system. They're buying that off
Well,
an
it sounds
Army.
like it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Mr. Sullivan, what do you say to my question?
I would agree with that. As we understand the position of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, that is the position that should be making these decisions. And we don't see that.
Instead, each of the services is making the decision.
We don't
and
see
then
that happening. The services and you know, there's enough that you're getting into here that could be a whole different hearing
Well,
on
I'm
acquisition.
suspecting we might, but I mean,
Yeah.
somebody's going to set priorities here. And sometimes you
Yes.
say no.
Yes, sir.
And so maybe this service's request isn't as important as somebody else's, and one has to be delayed a little bit, the other has to be expedited.
Yes.
That's, I would think, the referee's job here, which is the Department of Defense and that acquisition group on that. Maybe
And-
that
and-
is,
and
Mr.
I-
Flake,
and
a
certainly-
thing for another hearing someday.
Certainly, Mr. Weatherington, like you stated, this isn't the only place that this happens. This is
Yeah, this is,
all
look, this is
over.
not a blame game thing. You guys are all working as hard as you can, and we appreciate that, but I guess it's our job, sitting where we're sitting, to start helping people focus a little bit here and thinking of different ways to do it. Prioritization would be one thing on that. Putting some central management and discipline into it would be another way to go about it. And the other part that we haven't got into today, but will probably be part of any future hearing that we do on this, we continue right across all acquisitions to see too few really qualified managers, too few qualified schedulers, so that even when we try to have oversight, we've just been hollowed out a little bit, and we don't find that we have the resources there. We've talked about this with the people in various aspects of that agency on that, and we're going to have to find out what the Department of Defense's plan is to get people in. I know that it's competitive financially. Some people get a better job going off in the private sector, and it's hard to entice people. So what's our plan to turn that around? What's our plan so that when we go to production with something, we have good schedulers who keep us online, good product managers to keep us online, and somebody to say, no, we're not going to change this 15 times along the path here, which helps escalate the cost all the way up. So we probably will get into that a little bit more. But Mr. Flake, do you have any additional questions you want to ask on that? I do think that this is going to probably require us to talk a little bit about the subsystems, the commonality between those, the uniqueness, needs, and things of that nature. We want to talk with the idea of how do we not stifle innovation while we're doing that, and all of those things at another point. Let me give each of you the opportunity to tell me what we should have asked you or should have explored here that we should bring up at the next meeting, if we can. Mr. Sullivan?
Well, I think I just would say that it's an exciting area to be in. And we were just kind of going through all the problems with the acquisition process, and certainly this isn't immune to it. But what I see with unmanned systems is an opportunity to really capitalize on standardization and plug-and-play kind of things. And I would also say that the roadmap that Mr. Weatherington's office has published has goals in it that I think are goals and priorities that are pretty sound, but somebody has to listen to them. And a lot of them drive towards commonality, standardization as a way to reduce duplication and save money in the acquisition process.
When would be an appropriate time, Mr. Sullivan, for us to ask GAO to take a look at the performance of the department in meeting those goals? I mean, giving them time to get them up and running before we start, trying to critique them, but.
That might be something, well, the latest roadmap was, when was that issued?
Late last year.
Maybe
Mr. Weatherington, what do you think is a fair time for us to ask Mr. Sullivan's group to take a look and see how closely you're adhering to that?
Sir, that's really on your timeline.
Well, it is, but I'm asking for a recommendation from you. I could ask for it tomorrow, and it would seem unfair to you because you just passed the darn things.
Yes, sir.
Is that something, we can probably discuss that with your staff and figure out a way where
All right,
we're
but let's keep
resourced.
Mr. Weatherington in the loop here so that he doesn't
Yeah.
feel like he's an unfair assessment on that. I want it to be constructive.
Yes, sir.
This isn't about, as I said earlier, playing tag with people or anything like that. We want to be able to look at it a little bit out and then say it's working or it's not working, how are we doing on these things? Mr. Weatherington, anything else that we should add?
No, sir.
Okay. Mr. Wolf?
Just one follow-up thought on your China question about exports from China, for example, and I forgot to mention that there are various statutes that give the U.S. government the ability to impose sanctions against foreign companies that are engaged in proliferation-related activities, which would include the export of UAVs and other MTCR-controlled items to Iran and other sanctioned countries. Those regulation, I mean, those statutes are largely administered by the State Department, but that is another avenue that the U.S. government has in terms of trying to affect and prevent the flow of non-U.S. origin exports from third countries.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just leave you with this, though. Why don't combatant commands' sense of warfighting requirements drive the procurement requirements, since we do fight jointly rather than as individual services?
The combatant commands
anybody-
should have more say in what the requirements are for the weapon systems. I agree. Goldwater Nichols was a major piece of legislation passed a long time ago that was trying to matrix all that. And if you look at it, I think we did it very well on the operations side, but
Not on the
on the
procurement
acquisition side, it didn't take too well.
Do your goals, Mr. Wetherington, sort of get us back in that direction at all, do you feel?
Sir, actually, one of the goals specifically talked to meeting specific urgent warfighter requirements. And I would articulate that it is difficult to find any other technology in the Department of Defense that in a single decade has made such a tremendous impact on the warfighting capability of the department. That is not to say that we've done everything perfectly, because in many cases we had to react very, very quickly. But I believe the process we have today with the formal acquisition process and the opportunity for warfighters to send in urgent warfighter requirements get equal weight in our acquisition process.
Yeah. And this, as I say, these oversight hearings are about getting things perfect in the future, more so than beating people up over the past. So the idea is, how can we help you, and how can our oversight process help you meet the goals that are, if they're reasonable goals, of getting there, so that we do it on that way, and that's what we'll strive for. We're all set. Thank you all very, very much. I'm sorry that it went so late because of the votes and things of that nature, but you've been extremely helpful, and I suspect we may be getting back to take advantage of your expertise sometime in the future as well. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.